Shavuot Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Shabbat. We're up to Perek Bet Mishnah Zayin. Today's Mishnah should be Le'il Nishmat, Neria ben Tzvedlana, Aranbayev, Neliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Menuchatam beGan Eden, Amen. The Mishnah begins, Shelosha Devarim Tzarich Adam Lomar Beto Erev Shabbat Im Chashecha. A person must say three things in his house to the members of his family on Erev Shabbat just before dark, and the Rav explains he should give these instructions in a gentle manner so that the members of his family will listen to him. Isartem, have you taken maaser and tirumah from the food we will eat on Shabbat? As a background, we know the Torah forbids eating produce that grew in Eretz Israel until all the necessary portions have been removed from it. One first removes a portion, usually 1/50th, that must be given to a Kohen, tirumah. Then a tenth that must be given to a Levi, Maaser Rishon, and then a second tenth that in some years must be eaten in Yerushalayim, Maaser Sheni, and in other years must be given to the poor, Maaser Ani. A Levi who receives Maaser Rishon must give 1/10 to a Kohen, Terumat Maaser. Now the rabbis forbade removing these portions on Shabbat because it resembles the biblical transgression of making a repair, which is forbidden under the Melacha Makeh Patish, striking the final hammer blow. Just as repairing something makes it fit for use, removing these portions make the food fit to be eaten. Eravtem, have you made the eruv arrangements we will need on Shabbat? There are two types of eruv. Number one, eruvet techumin. A person is rabbinically forbidden on Shabbat in Yom Tov to go more than 2,000 amot from where he was residing when the day began. This limit is called the Techum Shabbat boundary. However, one can change his place of residence and therefore his Techum before Shabbat or Yom Tov by means of an Eruvet Techumin. To make such an Eruv, he puts food in a place that is up to 2,000 amot from his actual residence. His residence is therefore shifted to that place and the 2,000 amot are measured from there. And the second type of Eruv is Eruvet Chatzerot. If several houses share an enclosed courtyard, it is rabbinically prohibited to move items from a house into the courtyard or vice versa on Shabbat, because a courtyard serving a number of houses resembles a Reshut Rabim, a public domain into which is biblically prohibited to carry. However, carrying between a house and a courtyard is permitted if one arranges an Eruvei Chatzerot. This is done by collecting a loaf of bread before Shabbat from every household and placing all the loaves into one of the houses. All the courtyard's residents are now considered to be living in the house where the bread was placed. The courtyard is therefore viewed as serving only that house rather than several, and no longer resembles a public domain, a Reshut Rabim. Accordingly, the rabbinic ban on carrying back and forth does not apply. Each of these two types of eruv is effective only if it was in place when Shabbat began. Therefore, one who needs an eruv must remind his family before Shabbat to prepare it. And then we have Rav Netanel, like the Shabbat lamp. Now the Rav explains, although the first two reminders are questions, this one is phrased as a command because the person can see whether or not the lamp was lit, doesn't have to ask about it. Since these household preparations may not be done on Shabbat, one must remind his family to take care of them before Shabbat begins. Now, a person should make these statements while there is still enough time for his family to complete the tasks before Shabbat. However, he should not remind them too early, the Rav explains, because thinking that they have plenty of time, they might delay performing the chores and eventually forget to do them altogether. The Mishnah discusses whether these and other activities may be done during Ben Hashmashot, twilight, which the period of Ben Hashmashot lasts from sunset until the appearance of 3 stars. It's a matter of doubt whether this period belongs to the outgoing day or the incoming night, as the Rambam explains in the Shabbat, chapter 5, Baracha 4. So the Mishnah is going to discuss whether these and other activities may be done during Ben Hashmashot on Friday, when it's still halachically unclear whether Shabbat has begun. Safek chashecha en chashecha. Right? Safek chashecha, safek en chashecha. During Ben Hashmashot on Friday, when there is a doubt whether it is dark, meaning night, or not yet dark, meaning day, again, safek chashecha, safek en chashecha. We have a doubt whether it's dark, which means night, or not yet dark, which means day. En me'asrin et avadai. We may not take maaser or tirumah from definite tevel, which means food from which tirumah or maaser has definitely not been separated. Then matbilim et akilim, and we may not immerse utensils in a mikvah to purify them from tumah. Now, a tameh utensil requires immersion in a mikvah in order to become tahor. This immersion is rabbinically forbidden on Shabbat because it repairs the utensil by making it fit for uses that were prohibited in its tameh state. Ved madikin et hanerot, and we may not light lamps. Now the Mefarshim explain, since the Tana has already said that even rabbinic prohibitions apply during Ben Hashmashot, it should go without saying that kindling a lamp, which is a biblical melacha, is forbidden at that time. So some therefore explain the Mishnah to mean one may not even ask a non-Jew to kindle a lamp during Ben Hashmashot. Now each of these activities is either a biblically forbidden melacha or at least strongly resembles one, like we explained. Therefore they are prohibited even during Ben Hashmashot, when Shabbat might have already started. The Mishnah now lists activities that, although they're forbidden on Shabbat itself, are permitted during Ben Hashmashot. Aval me'asrin et demai. During Ben Hashmashot, however, we may take maaser from demai. Demai is food bought from an amaretz, from which maaser might have already been separated. And as a background, the rabbis decreed that one who buys food from an amaretz, an unlearned person who does not recognize the importance of maaser, he must separate maaser from it before he eats it, because it's possible that the amaretz did not do so. So such food is called demai. In fact, the Mefarshim explain most Ame'aretz do remove maaser from their produce, so demai may therefore be eaten according to biblical law, because we have rov, even if one does not take maaser from it. So since removing maaser from demai does not change its biblical status, this act does not even resemble the biblical melacha of making a repair. So for this reason, the rabbis were lenient in regards to demai. Although they prohibited removing maaser from demai Shabbat itself, they allowed one to do so during Ben Hashmashot. And we may make an eruv chatzerot to permit carrying items on Shabbat to and from a shared courtyard. Now, carrying in a courtyard is biblically permitted. It was the rabbis who prohibited such carrying unless an eruv had been prepared. So since the institution of an eruv is entirely rabbinic, making an eruv is permitted during Ben Hashmashot. Now, this refers only to an eruv chatzerot, which permits carrying in a courtyard, and not to an eruv techumin, which allows one to travel beyond the techum Shabbat. The prohibition of traveling beyond the tchum, although it's rabbinic, is based on a biblical source, as the Gemara mentions in Masechet Eruvin, page 51a. And therefore, making an eruv techumin is to avoid this prohibition is considered a significant repair, and it's therefore prohibited during Ben Hashmashot. So when we say me'arvin, we're referring to specifically eruv chatzerot. And the Mishnah concludes, we may insulate hot food so that it will remain hot on Shabbat. The rabbis, we know, forbade insulating food on Shabbat because they were concerned that if the food cools off, one might heat it over a fire, which constitutes the melacha of cooking. This concern does not apply during Ben Hashmashot because food cooked for Shabbat is usually still hot at that time. Therefore, although insulating food is forbidden on Shabbat, it's permitted during Ben Hashmashot. Now, this leniency is limited to insulating food with a substance that merely preserves heat, right? Insulating food for Shabbat with a substance that increases the heat is forbidden even if it's done on Friday, like we will see right now in the following chapter. That is the end of Perek Bet Mishnah Zayin. We begin now with Perek Gimel Mishnah Aleph. Now, one of the 39 forbidden melachot is lighting a fire, mavir. This melacha includes not only lighting a fire in the first place, but even making an existing fire bigger and even stirring glowing coals to make them burn more brightly. To prevent people from stirring coals on Shabbat, the rabbis prohibited putting food over hot coals before Shabbat and letting it remain there on Shabbat, because the person might stir the coals on Shabbat. The next two Mishnayot discuss when this rabbinic decree applies and when it does not. We will be doing today Mishnah Aleph. Kira shesikua bikash uvigvava. If a kira stove was heated with straw or chips of wood, now a kira is a rectangular stove upon which two pots can be placed with the fire burning beneath them. If it was heated with straw or chips of wood, notnim aleh tavshil, we may place cooked food on it on Friday and let it remain there on Shabbat. This is permitted, the Mefarshim explain, because straw and chips of wood burn too quickly to form coals. So when a stove is fueled with either of these substances, there's no concern that one might stir coals on Shabbat. Begefet uvetzim. However, if the stove was heated with pulp or large pieces of wood, both of which do form coals. Now, pulp, the Rav explains, is the residue of olives or sesame after the juice has been squeezed out. This residue can be used as fuel. So Mishnah says, lo yiten, one may not place cooked food upon it before Shabbat and leave it there, because we are concerned that he will stir the coals on Shabbat, which is biblically forbidden under the melacha of lighting a fire. Now, the Mefarshim explain This restriction applies only to food that is either not yet fully cooked or is fully cooked, but would improve if it were cooked even more. In these cases, since cooking would improve the food, we are concerned that the person will stir the coals to make it cook faster. But if the food is fully cooked and would not be improved by further cooking, the Rav explains, one may leave it even on a stove fueled with pulp or large pieces of wood because he will not think of stirring the coals. Now, although he wants the stove to remain hot so that his food stays warm, he does not need to stir the coals for that purpose because the stove will remain warm enough on its own. A person would stir coals only if he wants to speed up the cooking process. Now, furthermore, if the food has not yet begun to cook at all when Shabbat begins, one may leave it on the stove. Since it will take a long time to cook, the person puts it out of his mind and will not think of stirring the coals. Ad sheigrof, right? So the Mishnah says, begefet uvetzim. If the stove was heated with pulp or large pieces of wood, lo yiten, one may not place cooked food upon it before Shabbat and leave it there. Ad sheigrof or ad sheiten et ha'efel. Which again means that using a stove heated with these last two types of fuel is prohibited unless before Shabbat he shovels out the coals, meaning he removes the coals from the stove, or places ash over them. Now the stove is useful even after its coals have been removed because it retains some of its original heat. Or you place ash over them. Once the coals have been removed or covered, there's no concern that one will stir coals on Shabbat. Covering burning coals with ashes cools them. So it can be assumed that once someone has deliberately done an act that cools the coals in his stove, he has stopped thinking about cooking the food, and therefore we don't have to be concerned that he will stir the coals to cook the food faster. Now, Tanaim disagree about what types of cooked items may be left on a kirah stove before Shabbat, even if its coals have been covered or removed. Bet Shammai say, chamin avalot tavshil. We may place hot water on the stove, but not cooked food. And the Mefarshim explain, even after the coals have been shoveled away, some embers remain, and Bet Shammai are concerned that one might stir them. The same applies where the coals have been covered, because some embers will undoubtedly remain exposed. Therefore, even in this case, Bet Shammai forbid leaving cooked food on the stove. But Bet Shammai agree that one may leave hot water, because water heats up quickly, becoming as hot as required even if one does not stir the embers. Nevertheless, Beit Shammai permit this only after the coals have been removed or covered and just embers remain. But Bet Hillel say, chamin v'tavshir, we may place both hot water and cooked food on it. Since the coals have either been removed or the person has deliberately cooled them, Bet Hillel permit leaving even cooked food on the stove. Now the Mishnah cites another dispute between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel about using a kirah stove whose coals have been removed or covered. This dispute concerns a cooked item that one permissibly left on the stove, namely hot water according to Bet Shammai, or even cooked food according to Bet Hillel. The question is whether after removing the item from the stove on Shabbat, one is allowed to put it back on Shabbat, what we call nalacha chazara. Bet Shammai say, notnin aval lo machzirin. We may remove it from the stove on Shabbat, but not put it back. Bet Shammai ruled, the Mefarshim explain, that once a person removes the hot water from the stove on Shabbat, he may not put it back, because he would thereby give the appearance of cooking on Shabbat. It's not actual cooking, however, provided that the water is still hot when he replaces it on the stove. That's not per se the problem. If the water is still hot, it's not per se the problem of cooking, but mechazek mevashel, the appearance of cooking. But Bet Hillel say, Af machzirin, we may even put it back, because Bet Hillel rule that one may return the removed food to the stove, because in their opinion, putting food back does not appear like cooking. However, this is true only if the person kept holding the food the entire time it was off the stove. Once he puts it down, which the Mefarshim discussed, does that mean table, does that mean ground? Bet Hillel agreed that he may no longer put it back on the stove, because he would then indeed give the impression that he is cooking it. Again, Rabotai, this mainly concerns halachot of Shia and Chazara and Siman Reish Nun Gimel. We're going to see Hatmana maybe later on, Reish Nun Zayin, but mainly Reish Nun Gimel in that area of Shulchan Aruch. For practical halachot, that's the end of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen v'Amen.